Chapter 1. Mr. Tench went out to look for his ether cylinder, out into the blazing Mexican sun and the bleaching dust. A few buzzards from the roof with shabby indifference. He wasn't carrion yet. Feeling of rebellion stirred Tench's heart, and he sawed up a piece of the road with splintering fingernails and tossed it feebly up at. One of them rose and flapped across the town, over the tiny plaza, over the bust of an ex-president, ex-general, ex-human being, over the two stalls which sold mineral water, towards the river and the sea. It wouldn't find anything there. The sharks looked after the carrion on that side. Mr. Tench went on across the plaza. He said Buenos dias to a man with a gun who sat in a small patch of shade against a wall. But it wasn't like England. The man said nothing at all, just stared malevolently up at Mr. Tench, as if he had never had any dealings with the foreigner, as if Mr. Tench were not responsible for his two gold bicuspid teeth. Mr. Tench went sweating by, past the treasury which had once been a church, towards the quay. Halfway he had come out for a glass of mineral water. That was all there was to drink in this prohibition state except beer, but that was a government monopoly and too expensive except on special occasions. An awful feeling of nausea gripped Mr. Tench in the stomach. It couldn't have been mineral water he wanted. Of course, his ether cylinder, the boat was in. He had heard its exultant piping when he lay on his bed after lunch. He passed the barbers and dentists and came out between a warehouse and the customs onto the river bank. The river went heavily by towards the sea between the banana plantations. The General Obregon was tied up to the bank, and beer was being unloaded. 100 cases were already stacked upon the quay. Mr. Tench stood in the shade of the customs house and thought, what am I here for? Memory drained out of him in the heat. He gathered his bile together and spat forlornly into the sun. Then he sat down on a case and waited. Nothing to do. Nobody would come to see him before 5. The General Obregon was about 30 yards long. A few feet of damaged reef boat, one lifeboat, a bell hanging on a rotten cord, an oil lamp in the bow. She looked as if she might weather 2 or 3 more Atlantic years if she didn't strike a norther in the Gulf. That, of course, would be the end of her. It didn't really matter. Everybody was insured when he bought a ticket automatically. Half a dozen passengers leaned on the rail, among the hobbled turkeys, and stared at the port, the warehouse, the empty baked street with the dentists and the barbers. Mr. Tench heard a revolver holster creak just behind him and turned his head. A customs officer was watching him angrily. He said something which Mr. Tench could not catch. "Pardon me," Mr. Tench said. "My teeth," the customs man said indistinctly. "Oh," Mr. Tench said, "yes, your teeth." The man had none. That was why he couldn't talk clearly. Mr. Tench had removed them all. He was shaken with nausea. Something was wrong. Worms, dysentery. He said, "The set is nearly finished tonight," he promised wildly. Of course, quite impossible, but that was how one lived, putting off everything. The man was satisfied. He might forget, and in any case what could he do? He had paid in advance. That was the whole world to Mr. Tench, the heat and the forgetting, the putting off till tomorrow, if possible cash down for what? He stared out over the slow river. The fin of a shark moved like a periscope at the mouth. In the course of years several ships had stranded and they now helped to prop up the riverside, the smokestacks leaning over like guns pointing at some distant objective across the swamps. Tench thought. Ether nearly forgot. His mouth fell open and he began moodily to count the bottles of syrup. 140 cases. 12 and 40, In 40, the heavy phlegm gathered in his mouth. 12 fours are 48. He said aloud in English, "My 5 God, a pretty one, 1200, 1680. He spat, staring with vague interest at a girl in the fine thin figure. They so thick, curly so thick, brown eyes, of course, inevitable, and the inevitable gleam of the gold tooth, but something fresh and young. 1680 bottles at a peso a bottle." Somebody asked in English, "What did you say?" Missed round, swiveled round. "You English?" he said in astonishment, but at the sight of the round and hollow face charred with a 3 days beard, he altered his question. "You speak English?" "Yes," the man said. He spoke English. He stood stiffly in the shade, in a shabby dark city suit, carrying a small attaché case. He had a novel under his arm. Bits of an amorous scene stuck out, crudely colored. He said, "Excuse me. I thought just now you were talking to me." He had protuberant eyes. He gave an impression of unstable hilarity, as if perhaps been celebrating a birthday, alone. Mr. Tench cleared his mouth of phlegm. "What did I say?" He couldn't remember a thing. "You said, 'My God, a pretty one.' Now what could I have meant by that?" He stared up at the merciless sky. A buzzard stood there like an observer. "What? Oh, just the girl, I suppose. You don't often see a pretty piece round here. Just 1 or 2 a year worth looking at. She is very young." "Oh, I don't have intentions," Mr. Tench said wearily. "A man may look. I've lived alone for 15 years. Hereabouts. They fell silent and time passed. The shadow of the customs house shifted a few inches farther towards the river. The buzzard moved a little, like the black hand of a dog. "You came in her?" Mr. Tench said. "No. Going in her?" The little man seemed to evade the question, but then, as if some explanation were required, "I was just looking," he said. "I suppose she'll be sailing quite soon." "To Veracruz," Mr. Tench said. "In a few hours." 6 without calling anywhere? "Where could she call?" he asked. "How did you get here?" The stranger said vaguely, "A canoe." "Got a plantation, eh?" "No. It's good hearing English spoken," Mr. Tench said. "Now you learn yours in the States." The man agreed. He wasn't very garrulous. "Ah, what wouldn't I give," Mr. Tench said, "to be there now." He said in a low, anxious voice, "You don't happen, do you, to have a drink in that case of yours? Some of you people back there I've known 1 or 2 a little for medical purposes." "Only medicine," the man said. "You a doctor?" The bloodshot eyes looked slyly out of their corners at Mr. Tench. "You would call me perhaps a quack?" "Patent medicines? Live and let live," Mr. Tench said. "Are you sailing?" "No, I came down here for, oh, well, it doesn't matter anyway." He put his hand on his stomach and said, "You haven't got any medicine, have you, for oh, hell. I don't know what. It's just this bloody land. You can't cure me of that." "No one can. You want to go home?" "Home," Mr. Tench said. "My home's here. Did you see what the peso stands at in Mexico City?" 4 to the dollar. 4. Oh. Or a pro nobis. Catholic? No. Just an expression. I don't believe in anything like that." He said irrelevantly, "It's too hot anyway. I think I must find somewhere to sit." "Come up to my place," Mr. Tench said. I've got a spare hammock. The boat won't leave for hours if you want to watch it go. The stranger said, I was expecting to see someone. The name was Lopez. Oh, they shot him weeks ago, Mr. Tench said. Dead? 7. You know how it is round here. Friend of yours? No, no, the man protested hurriedly. Just a friend of a friend. Well, that's how it is, Mr. Tench said. He brought up his bile again and shot it out into the hard sunlight. They say he used to help, undesirables, well, to get out. His girl's living with the chief of police now. His girl? Do you mean his daughter? He wasn't married. I mean the girl he lived with. Mr. Tench was momentarily surprised by an expression on the stranger's face. He said again, you know how it is. He looked across at the General Obregon. She's a pretty bit. Of course, in 2 years she'll be like all the rest. Fat and stupid. Oh, God, I'd like a drink. Or a Pro Nobis. I have a little brandy, the stranger said. Mr. Tench regarded him sharply. Where? The hollow man put his hand to his hip. He might have been indicating the source of his odd nervous hilarity. Mr. Tench seized his wrist. Careful, he said. Not here. He looked down the carpet of shadow. A sentry sat on an empty crate asleep beside his rifle. Come to my place, Mr. Tench said. I meant, the little man said reluctantly, just to see her go. Oh, it will be hours yet, Mr. Tench assured him again. Hours? Are you certain? It's very hot in the sun. You'd better come home. Home, it was a phrase one used to mean 4 walls behind which one slept. There had never been a home. They moved across the little burnt plaza where the dead general grew green in the damp and the gaseous stalls stood under the palms. It lay like a picture postcard on a pile of other postcards. Shuffle the pack and you had Nottingham, a METR Holland birthplace, an interlude in Southend. Mr. Tench's father had been a dentist too. His first memory was finding a discarded cast in a waste paper basket, the rough toothless gaping mouth of clay, like something dug up in Dorset Neanderthal or Pithecanthropus. It had been his favorite toy. They tried to tempt him with Meccano, but fate had struck. There is always one moment in childhood when the door opens and lets the future in. The hot wet 8 Riverport and the vultures lay in the waste paper basket, and he picked them out. We should be thankful we cannot see the horrors and degradations lying around our childhood, in cupboards and bookshelves, everywhere. There was no paving. During the rains the village, it was really no more, slipped into the mud. Now the ground was hard under the feet like stone. The 2 men walked in silence past barbers' shops and dentists. The buzzards on the roofs looked contented, like domestic fowls. They searched under wide crude dusty wings for parasites. Mr. Tench said, "Excuse me," stopping at a little wooden hut, 1 story high, with a veranda where a hammock swung. The hut was a little larger than the others in the narrow street, which petered out 200 yards away in swamp. He said, nervously, "Would you like to take a look around? I don't want to boast, but I'm the best dentist here. It's not a bad place." As places go. Pride wavered in his voice like a plant with shallow roots. He led the way inside, locking the door behind him, through a dining room where 2 rocking chairs stood on either side of a bare table, an oil lamp, some copies of old American papers, a cupboard. He said, "I'll get the glasses out, but first I'd like to show you're an educated man." The dentist's operating room looked out on a yard where a few turkeys moved with shabby nervous pomp, a drill which worked with a pedal, a dentist's chair gaudy in bright red plush, a glass cupboard in which instruments were dustily jumbled. A forceps stood in a cup, a broken spirit lamp was pushed into a corner, and gags of cotton wool all the shelves. Very fine, the stranger said. It's not so bad, Mr. Tench said, for this town. You can't imagine the difficulties. That drill, he said bitterly, is made in Japan. I've only had it a month and it's wearing out already. But I can't afford American drills. The window, the stranger said, is very beautiful. One pane of stained glass had been let in. A Madonna gazed out through the mosquito wire at the turkeys in the yard. I got it, Mr. Tench said, when they sacked the church. It didn't feel right, a dentist's room without some stained glass. Not civilized. At home, I mean in England, it was 9 generally the laughing cavalier. I don't know why, or else a Tudor rose. But one can't pick and choose. He opened another door and said, my workroom. The first thing under a bed under a mosquito tent. Said, Tench said, and I am pressed for room. A ewer and basin stood at one end of a carpenter's bench, and a soap dish, at the other a blowpipe, a tray of sand, pliers, a little furnace. I cast in sand, Mr. said. What else can I do in this place? He picked up the cast of a jaw. You can't always get them accurate, he said. Of course, they complain. He laid it down again. Another object on the bench, something stringy and intestinal in appearance, with bladders of rubber. Congenital fissure, he said. It's the first time I've tried. The Kingsley case. I can do it. Doubt if I can do it. But a man must try to keep abreast of his mouth fell open. The look of vacancy returned. The heat in the small room was overpowering. He stood there like a man lost in a cavern among the fossils and instruments of an age of which he knows very little. The stranger said, if we could sit down. Mr. Tench stared at him blankly. We could open the brandy. Oh, yes, the brandy. Mr. Glasses out of a cupboard under the bench. Then they went and sat in rocking chairs in the front room. Mr. Tench poured out. The stranger said. You can't trust the water, Mr. Tench said. It's got me here. He put his hand on his stomach and took a long draught. Yourself, he said. He took a longer look. Teeth. One canine had gone, and the front teeth were yellow, harder and carious. He said, you want to pay attention to them. What is the good? The stranger said. He held a small spot of brandy in his glass if it were an animal to which he gave shelter, but not trust. He had the air in his hollowness and neglect of somebody of no account who had been beaten up incidentally, by ill health or restlessness. He sat on the edge of the rocking chair, with his small attaché 10 case balanced on his guilty of encouraged him. It will do you good. Sloping shoulder, uncomforted him, and death was in his carious mouth already. Tench poured himself out another glass. He said, it gets lonely here. It's good to talk even to a foreigner. I wonder if you'd like to see kids of my kids. He drew a yellow snapshot out of his note case and handed it over. 2 small children struggled over the watering can in a back garden. Of course, he said, they are young men now. One died. Well, the other said gently. He took a golden smile Randy and smiled at Mr. Tench rather foolishly. I suppose so, Mr. Surprise. He got rid of his, it and said, it doesn't seem to me, of course, much. He fell silent, his way, ambling away, mouth fell open. He looked gray and vacant, until recalled by a pain in the stomach and see, what was about the kids. It's funny what a man remembers. Can better than I can. 11 pence 3 farthing. I could lead or I bought it. He brooded over it. Past I can't remember crying. Do you get news? Oh, before I came here, what was the use? I couldn't send any money. It wouldn't surprise me if the wife had married. Her mother would like it though. She never cared for me. It is awful. Companion and his companion again sat there like a black question mark ready to go, poised on his chair. Disreputable in his gray 3 days beard and weak, somebody you could command to do any, he said, I mean the world, way things happen. 11 you dripped at it, he sipped at it. He said, you remember this before the red shirts, I suppose I do. How happy it was then. Was it? I didn't notice. They had at any rate God. There's teeth, Mr. Tench said. Some more of the stranger's brandy. It was always an awful place. My God. People at home would have said romance. I thought, years here, and then I'll go. There was plenty of work. Gold teeth, and the peso dropped. Get out. One day I will. He said, I'll retire. Go live as a gentleman ought to live. I'll forget all this. Oh, it won't be long now. I'm an optimist, Mr. Tench said. The stranger said suddenly, how long will she take to Veracruz? Who? The boat. Mr. Tench said gloomily, 40 hours from now and we'd be there. The Diligencia. A good hotel. Dance places too. A gay town. It makes it seem close, the stranger said. And a ticket, how much would that be? You'd have to ask Lopez, said. He's the agent. But yes. Oh, yes. They shot him. Somebody knocked on the door. The stranger slipped the attaché case under his chair, and Mr. Tench went cautiously up towards the window. Can't be too careful. Any dentist who's worth the name has enemies. A faint voice implored them, a friend, and Mr. Tench opened up. The sun came in like a white-hot bar. A child stood in the doorway asking for a doctor. He wore a big hat and had stupid brown eyes. Beyond him 2 mules stamped and whistled on the hot beaten road. Mr. Tench said he was not a doctor, he was a dentist. Looking round he saw the stranger crouched in the rocking chair, gazing with an effect of prayer, entreaty. The child said there was a new Dr. 12 in town, the old one had fever and wouldn't stir. It was his mother who was sick. Memory stirred in Mr. Tench's brain. He said with an air of disgust, You're a doctor, aren't you? No. I've got to you said. It won't leave. It won't leave. It won't leave. It won't leave for hours yet, Tench said. Tench said. On time. How far? How far? The child said it was 6 leagues away. Too far, Mr. Tench said. Go away. Find someone else. He said to the stranger, how things get around. Everyone must know you are in town. I could do no good, the stranger said anxiously. He seemed to be asking Mr. Tench humbly. Humbly. Go away, Mr. Tench did not stir, did not stir, did not stir. He stood in the hard sunlight looking in with infinite patience. He said his mother was dying. The brown eyes expressed no. It was a fact. It was a fact. You were born. Your parents died. You grew old. You died yourself. If she's dying, Mr. Tench said, there's no point in a doctor seeing her. But the stranger had got up. Unwillingly he had been summoned to an occasion he couldn't pass by. He said sadly, it always seems to happen. Like this. You'll have a job not to miss the boat. I shall miss it, he said. I am meant to miss. He was shaken by a tiny rage. Give me my brandy. He took a long pull at it, with his eyes on the impassive child, the baked street, the buzzards moving in the sky like indigestion spots. But if she's dying, Mr. Tench said, I know these people. She will be no more dying than I am. You can do no good. The child watched them as if he didn't care. The argument in a foreign language going on in there was something abstract. He wasn't concerned. He would just wait here till the doctor came. You know nothing, the stranger said fiercely. That is what everyone all the time says, you do no good. The brandy 13 had affected him. He's bitterness monstrous. I can hear them saying it all over the world. Anyway, Mr. Tench said, or 3 weeks. You are lucky. You can get out. You got your capital here. He thought of his capital, the Japanese drill, the dentist's chair, the spirit lamp and the pliers and the little oven for the gold fillings, a stake in the country. Vamos, the man said to the child. He turned back to Mr. Tench and told him that he was grateful for the rest out of the sun. He had the kind of dwarf dignity. Mr. Tench was accustomed to the dignity of people afraid of a little pain and yet sitting down with some firmness in his chair. Perhaps he didn't care for mule travel. He said with an effect of old-fashioned ways, I will pray for you. You were welcome, Mr. Tench said. The man got up onto the mule, and the child led the way, very slowly under the bright glare, towards the swamp, the interior. It was from there the man had emerged this morning to take a look at the General Obregon. Now he was going back. He swayed very slightly in his saddle from the effect of the brandy. He became a minute disappointed figure at the end of the street. It had been good to talk to a stranger, Mr. Tench thought, going back into his room, locking the door behind him. One never knew. Loneliness faced him there, vacancy. But he was as accustomed to both as to his own fate. Alas. He sat down in the rocking chair and moved up and down, creating a faint breeze in the heavy air. A narrow column of ants moved across the room to the little patch on the floor where the stranger had spilled some brandy. They milled in it, then moved on in an orderly line to the opposite wall and disappeared. Down in the river the General Obregon whistled twice. He didn't know why. The stranger had left his book behind. It lay under his rocking chair. A woman in Edwardian dress crouched sobbing upon a rug embracing a man's brown polished pointed shoes. He stood above her disdainfully with a little waxed mustache. The book was called La Eterna Martyr. After a time Mr. Tench picked it up. When he opened it he was taken aback. What was printed inside didn't seem to belong. It was Latin. Mr. 14Tench grew thoughtful. He picked the book up and carried it into his workroom. You couldn't burn a book, but it might be as well to hide it if you were not sure, that is, of what it was all about. He put it inside the little oven for gold alloy. Then he stood by the carpenter's bench, his mouth hanging open. He had remembered what had taken him to the key, the ether cylinder which should have come downriver in the General Obregon. Again the whistle blew from the river, and Mr. Tench ran without his hat into the sun. He had said the boat would not go before morning, but you could never trust those people not to keep to timetable, and sure enough, when he came out onto the bank between the customs and the warehouse, the General Obregon was already 10 feet off in the sluggish river, making for the sea. He bellowed after it, but it wasn't any good. There was no sign of a cylinder anywhere on the quay. He shouted once again, and then didn't trouble any more. It didn't matter so much after all. A little additional pain was hardly noticeable in the huge abandonment. On the General Obregon a faint breeze began to blow. Banana plantations on either side, reels on a point. The port slipped behind. When you looked back you could not have told that it had ever existed at all. The wide Atlantic opened up, the great gray cylindrical waves lifted the bows, and the hobbled turkeys shifted on the deck. The captain stood in the tiny deck house with a toothpick in his hair. The land went backward at a slow even roll, and the dark came quite suddenly, with a sky of low and brilliant stars. One oil lamp was lit in the bows, and the girl whom Mr. Tench had spotted from the bank began to sing gently a melancholy, sentimental, and contented song about a rose which had been stained with true love's blood. There was an enormous sense of freedom and air upon the gulf, with the low tropical shoreline buried in darkness as deeply as any mummy in a tomb. I am happy, the young girl said to herself without considering why. I am happy. Far back inside the darkness the mules plodded on. The effect of the brandy had long ago worn off, and the man bore in his brain along the marshy tract which, when the rains came, would be quite impassable the sound of the General Obregon's siren. He knew what it meant. The ship had kept 15 to timetable. He was abandoned. He felt an unwilling hatred of the child ahead of him and the sick woman. He was unworthy of what he carried. A smell of damp came up all round him. It was as if this part of the world had never been dried in the flame when the world was sent spinning off into space. It had absorbed only the mist and cloud of those awful spaces. He began to pray, bouncing up and down to the lurching, slithering mule's stride, with his brandied tongue. Let me be caught soon. Let me be caught. He had tried to escape,